Hello everybody, this is lesson 15 of the lecture International Financial Markets. I will discuss slides 31 to 40 of chapter 3, Central Banks and International Financial Markets. In this lesson we will discuss how central banks influence the exchange rate via the interest parity channel and via the purchasing power parity channel. We will start with the interest parity channel. The interest parity channel plays out over the interest parity relationship which we have already derived. If the central bank increases domestic credit supply such that the domestic interest rate falls, the interest parity equation is disturbed in the first moment, such that an investment in a Eurobond provides a lower return as an investment in a dollar bond. As a result, the domestic currency depreciates on the spot market, and or since the money is invested in the foreign capital market, the foreign interest rate falls, and or since the money return is repatriated by the end of the investment period, the forward exchange rate appreciates. At least one of these adjustments must occur, else there would be left an opportunity for riskless arbitrage profits. We have now discovered the following causal chain. Increase in the domestic money supply by the central bank, decrease in the domestic interest rate, which causes an increase in the demand for foreign currency, what causes depreciation of the domestic currency on the spot market, an increase in credit supply to the foreign credit market, what causes a decrease in the foreign interest rate, and an increase in the demand for domestic forward currency, what causes an appreciation of the domestic forward rate. This causal chain evolves, of course, only if no other effects happen at the same time. The strength of each effect depends on the empirical size of the market parameters, the slopes of the demand and supply curves, in other words. This analysis shows that there is an interdependency of foreign and domestic capital markets. The monetary policy of the European Central Bank, for example, affects the capital markets in other countries whose capital markets are open for investors of the European Currency Union. And of course, the opposite direction exists also. Foreign central banks can influence the interest rate on the European capital markets. Internationally open capital markets imply interdependency of national monetary politics. Next, we turn now to the so-called purchasing power parity channel. Effects of monetary policy which run over the interest parity channel affect financial markets primarily in the short term. There is, however, also a medium or long-term effect of monetary policy on the exchange rate, which we have not analyzed so far. And this is called the purchasing power parity channel. Let's have a closer look at the purchasing power parity channel. We start again with an increase of money supply by the central bank. That, of course, leads to a decrease in the domestic interest rate. This decrease in the domestic interest rate has now a couple of additional effects, as we have discussed so far when we discussed the interest parity channel. For example, typically we receive an increase in domestic investment if the domestic interest rate goes down. Additionally, also domestic consumption depends negatively on the interest rate. So if the interest rate goes down, domestic consumption goes up. Now, we know from our discussion of the interest parity channel that a reduction in the domestic interest rate causes a depreciation of the domestic currency. As a result, domestic prices paid in foreign currency are now lower as before. This means that the purchasing power parity relationship is disturbed in the first moment. As a result, domestic goods are cheaper as foreign goods. This causes additional demand in domestic exports, so domestic exports get larger, and at the same time a decrease in domestic imports, since goods in other currency areas are now more expensive for domestic consumers given the depreciation of the domestic currency. If we take now all these effects together, then we can observe that the total domestic demand, all components of domestic demand, gets larger. Consumption gets larger, domestic investment gets larger, export demand gets larger, and import demand gets smaller, but import demand depends negatively on total domestic demand, and as a result this also increases total domestic demand, the demand for domestic goods. This causes now an increase in domestic demand over domestic supply of goods and services. So we have domestic excess demand. And now, after a certain time lag, typically in the European area, half a year up to 1 year, the price level starts to grow. So now the prices of domestic goods get more expensive. And this increase of the domestic price level affects now again the purchasing power parity relationship. First, the purchasing power parity relationship was disturbed because monetary policy resulted in a lower spot exchange rate. But now this lower spot exchange rate is neutralized by the higher domestic price level, such that by the end of this adjustment process, the purchasing power parity holds again. Domestic prices times the spot exchange rate equal the foreign price level. So there is a kind of built-in tendency towards the long-run return of the exchange rate to the purchasing power parity. If domestic monetary policy leads to short-term depreciation of the domestic currency, the purchasing power parity relationship is disturbed, and this results in an increase in demand for domestic goods, which causes a long-run increase in the domestic price level, so that the purchasing power parity relationship finally is re-established again, however, at a lower exchange rate and a higher price level. So much for this lesson. In the next lesson we will start with an analysis of a couple of international financial market crisis episodes.